Welcome into Rounding the Bases Live, presented by Enterprise Bank and Trust. My name is Joel Goldberg. Hope that everyone out there had a good weekend, a hot one. If you're here in Kansas City, I was thinking about this yesterday. I'll admit I'm usually a little bit uncomfortable over at the ballpark on those super hot, scorching days, and it can be a little bit tough to work. I wish I was out there sweating yesterday. That was not the case. I thought about doing the lawn, but it was 90, felt like 95, so I just shut it down yesterday. I am energized and ready to go. I want to thank my friends at Enterprise Bank and Trust, hashtag no stopping you, for their partnership in this endeavor. I've really enjoyed working with them and actually stopped over at the bank on Saturday for a quick transaction, but love everything that they do. Also, my friends at Casey Cattle Company up in Weston, Missouri. Check out their website or their social media. Get an idea of when that stock is in. It's Wagyu beef, burgers, hot dogs, brats, steaks, you name it. It is unbelievable, and they deliver to all 50 states, and they'll bring it down here to the Kansas City area too. I mentioned they're veteran owned and operated, so check them out and their social media feeds for all of the updates. And finally, the good folks over at JJ's Wine and Spirits. If you're down in the Johnson County area, they're in Overland Park at the southwest corner of College and Antioch. Don't forget, Wednesday, Wine Wednesdays, 15% off all bottles of wine. What I like about it over there, too, good personal touch. You got a suggestion that you want, you got something that you're unsure of, they've got the answers. They're the ones that are ordering it. They know what's going on, so check them out. And their Facebook page, JJ's Wine and Spirits. For many of you in Kansas City or beyond, my next guest probably shouldn't need an introduction. Or if you watch what we do on Royals baseball, if you were keeping score, I don't know that we've kept score, you might say that Bob Kendrick has been the most frequent guest of ours over the years. I just did a little post on LinkedIn to promote the show today. A little bit late, by the way. I was running behind on some stuff, but I mentioned that I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller in baseball in my speaking career, and I don't know a better storyteller out there, period, than my friend Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And it looks like, I think you're in the office today, aren't you, Bob?
I am in the office.
That's good. I
Yeah.
mean, it's good to get out a little bit and good to get back to a little bit of normalcy. If anybody watches the different shows and stuff that I'm involved in, on Friday, we had Bob on and Dave Sims, who is the television voice of the Seattle Mariners, longtime announcer for all sports in this country. And we had a long, hour discussion about minorities in baseball and race in this country. And we'll do a little bit of that today. I want to have a little bit of a different conversation, some similarities, but I just think it's an important time right now. And, Bob, what really struck me, we don't need to recap that whole conversation, was to hear Dave Sims, who, by the way, dated himself when he said that his first job was in 1973, because he does not look like he should have been working in 73. But he said he'd only had a couple conversations in a media forum like that ever, which made me think, man, we've really missed the boat here, and there's an opportunity. How many more of these conversations are you having right now?
Quite a few. Yeah, it's been the focal point. And I guess, despite the cause for these conversations, I am pleased that people are turning toward the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to get its view on these kinds of topics and discussion. Because I think at the forefront of what this museum is all about, it is a museum about social injustice. And it is a museum that is about the civil rights movement in this country. And so as we were creating this as initially as an attraction, our goal as an institution is to be at the forefront of these very important and pertinent discussions in and around race and sports in our society. So it pleases me that people are turning to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to gain its perspective and input.
When you talk about a museum about social injustice, and I've said this a million times, I'll continue to say it, that if you have not been to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, you're missing out. You got to go. And if you have been, you know that you want to go back because there's just never enough time. It just, and there's a feeling, even for someone that is white, there is a feeling to me when I walk in there that I don't have anywhere else. It's almost like transporting you back in time. Now there's a whole discussion now about, wait a minute, maybe we're still back in time with the way things have gone. And that's been my observation is, wait a minute, maybe I should be feeling this outside of the museum too. But Bob, and I don't know that I've told you this, I don't think I have, but we were driving down to Florida in March, right? I mean, the day that the Big 12 tournament was canceled. So that was that Thursday. So, we weren't doing masks yet. We were starting to be a little bit hesitant. And we spent the night in your home state of Georgia. And, which I remember, by the way, you're like this one, going to a Waffle House before we left the next morning was an option. On the way home, driving home a week later, that was no longer an option. That's how quickly things changed. But we stopped and we went and we visited the Martin Luther King museum, and we went into the church and we went to his house and all of that. And I got to tell you, it's one of the few times where I said, man, I wish I didn't have my teenagers with me, because teenagers only have a shelf life of so long, because I could have spent the whole day in there. And I remember when I walked out of there thinking, this is the exact feeling that I have every time I walk in the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Those are the two of the only places that I felt that way. And it just, I don't know how to describe it, but it's just a feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is such a powerful experience. But the thing that I love about the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, because most stories as it relates to the civil rights story and African Americans in this country, they're very painful stories. They are stories of us being sprayed by water hoses and the dogs released on us and the police brutality of yesteryear that we're now focused on still yet today. But the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum gives you a counter perspective of this. It is triumph over adversity. And so it is not the typical pain laden experience. Because when you walk in here, you see people who were immaculately dressed, and it's told through the lens of baseball. And what an amazing success story this is. So, and it's built around a premise of the fact that you won't let me play with you. Okay, I'll just create my own. And for me, I think it is important that you see every facet of my story, not just the downtrodden aspect of it, but also the accomplishments and the success stories that have been so much a part of the fabric of the African American experience in this country. And that's what we bring to the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
There ain't nothing sad or somber about the story, even though it is against the backdrop of American segregation. But it's all of this kind of channeled energy and passion to say, oh, you can't stop me from playing ball. I'll show you. And then they built a thriving business enterprise that would so greatly impact so many African American communities across this country. And I think that's the prevailing spirit that people gain when they come here to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
Yeah, and you walk away with a better education. Again, I'll just mention that with what's going on in this country and the world for that matter, I love that Dave Sims said the other day, are you freaking kidding me? They're protesting in Berlin of all places. I mean,
absolutely.
This Black Lives Matter movement now is in full force globally, which I think is beautiful. But I think maybe that's one of the challenges too, is like, you walk out of that museum and let's not forget that everything is just perfect. Things have come a long ways. Things are different in many ways than what is depicted from that generation in the museum. However, we obviously have such a long ways to go. I ask you this question all the time. I'm going to pull this out here. Okay, I'm glad I grabbed him by the head. But I've got Buck here who just sits there. I feel like, and I've told you this a million times, I never got to meet Buck. I got here in 2008 my path never crossed with him, so it's not a regret. I couldn't control it. It's certainly one of my disappointments in life. Yet I feel like because of your storytelling, and you're keeping his legacy alive every single day, that I do know him. And I sit there and I kind of envision like this guy sitting back, maybe in his red seat at Kauffman Stadium, and observing everything that is going on in our
Yeah.
community and Kansas City, or beyond Kansas City. And I wonder, I ask you this question all the time. What would Buck think about Dress to the Nines Day today? What would Buck think about this? You spent so much time with him. What would he think about what's going on in our country and around the world right now?
Well, Buck for me was the most optimistic individual that I ever met. He was the consummate glass half full, where most people see the glass half empty. Buck always saw the glass half full. And it would have pained him to see what we all witnessed because it would have been so reminiscent of the experiences that he had and people who looked like him had 60, 70 years ago. But I just know who I know his heart. And his heart is one that always believed in humanity, that humanity will prevail. And typically it does. And I think he would have been so moved by what you already described. People around the world coming together to try and right a wrong. And what saddens us is that it has taken the loss of human life and to get to this point where we do come together in an effort to try and change some things that need to be changed in our society. But the beautiful thing about Buck O'Neill is he just never gave up on people. He never would. And I think in this instance, he wouldn't. His heart would be warmed by what he would have witnessed in terms of everybody seemingly coming together. Yeah, because he just never gave up on people.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it, and I think that we're seeing that spirit from so many people. I thought it was interesting the other day when you and Dave Sims and Victor Rojas and I had the conversation. We went well over an hour, and we could have gone another 10. I mean, it just people had places to go. There was so much to talk about, and I think to me what was heartbreaking among other things was the discussion about the way you send your kids out for the day, and that if you are a person of color, a parent of color, that you have to give the speech.
To speak.
I never had the speech
Yeah, yeah,
as a kid. I remember at some point, I actually feel like it was my grandfather. I don't know if I got pulled over with him in the car or we were just driving because he was visiting from out of town. But I just remember him saying, hey, if you ever get pulled over, don't reach into the glove compartment to grab your license or your registration or whatever, because they might think that you're doing something. But it wasn't like a mandatory speech, and it wasn't a last thing you tell your kid before you leave the house.
yeah.
But yet you never knew any other way. Your kids never knew any other way. That was heartbreaking to me to hear that, generation after generation, that in a black household is what has to be passed along.
Yeah, it hurts me. I think when I think about what has transpired and I go back and I think back to my own parents, as a kid growing up in the 60s, as I shared with you guys, and being the baby of six, and they sat us all down and gave us what we needed, the wherewithal for what we would need. And like I told you guys, I call them, they were giving us what I call survival skills. So here's what you do in the event that you are stopped by law enforcement. And as I mentioned to you guys, their concern was not about my pride and my dignity. Yeah. No, they weren't concerned about pride and dignity. They were concerned about their child coming back home to them alive so that he could tell his story and live to tell his story another day. And you fast forward 50 years later, I got to share that same story. I got to tell my kids the exact same thing, in 2020. And I think that's what disappoints you. That is what saddens you because you should not have to have that conversation. But I think for virtually every Black family, that's a conversation that is had. And if it isn't a conversation, it should be a conversation because inevitably we've been encountering those kind of situations and circumstances. And so as I look back and reflect, and my parents who were, they had no more than 10th grade education. That's all they could get in the South at that time.
Hmm.
But the wisdom that they had was that of a Rhodes Scholar, because these were life experiences that they were passing along to us. And I still draw strength from those things that they taught. But again, it absolutely saddens you that you got to have that same conversation today.
Yeah, and I think that those conversations, unfortunately, will continue from a safety standpoint. However, I feel like the young generation now is, to use the expression that I'm too old to use, they're woke, and they're very aware of it. That includes my kids, as teenagers, that they're seeing things that generations before them didn't see. And so the flip side, I mentioned to you the other day that my little brother, big brothers, big sisters, who will be 32 this week, he told me he had no hope, and that broke my heart. And that's based on his experiences.
Yeah.
So I could sit here and tell him it's going to be okay, but I can't. I believe it will get better, but I think the deeper discussion there is like, how can you tell someone what it's going to be if you haven't yet walked in their shoes? And
Yeah.
and so if he's had moments in St. Louis that have that have given him a different perspective in terms of living his life to the fullest or living in fear, who am I to tell him otherwise?
Yeah. And again, you don't want to see that generation give up, and the hopelessness that some of them feel, because again, despite the circumstances that I grew up in rural Georgia, I always had hope. My parents instilled hope. But that was also the beauty of having two parents who were there with me, guiding me along the way, and who always wanted to see their children do better than they did. And so they instilled that belief system. They put it in you. And they created, through their life experiences, the belief that you can be better and you will be better. So, Joel, I just never had any doubt in my mind that there would be a measure of success for me. Now, again, we all measure success in different ways. Some
Sure.
do it by money, others do it by things that they enjoy. But I always felt like my circumstances growing up in rural Georgia, African American kid growing up in rural Georgia, in the deep South, would not prevent me from gaining as meaningful life experiences as I possibly could. And I thank them for instilling that in me. Now, everybody doesn't have that foundation.
Right.
And they don't. And that's the sad part of it. We all have that foundation. But, I thank my parents every day for what they gave me. And that was a belief system.
Some of the comments coming in, and I know this is a mutual friend. And, Kiana, well, I'm just getting to know her a little bit, but I know that you know her well. And I think my question, I popped her comment up there for a reason. She's part of that younger generation.
She's part of that younger generation, absolutely.
And I know how active she is. I know how much she believes in the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. You're carrying on the legacy from Buck. Even with your energy, you won't be here forever, although in my mind you will be. But we've got to pass that on, don't
Yeah.
we?
Yeah, we do. We absolutely do. And I think that's one of the reasons, Joel, that we work so hard. It's important that as an institution, we make this history relevant to an ever-changing generation of young people. And I do think it's a misnomer that people believe kids are not concerned about history, that they don't care about history. I think they do. I just think it becomes a matter of how that history is presented to them. And honestly, I think the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum may be more important today than ever before. And so young people are encountering this kind of activism really for the first time. And when kids walk into the museum and they get to experience a segregated America for the first time, again, they may experience racism in some way, shape, form, or fashion, but they haven't experienced what a segregated society was like. And it blows them away. They can't fathom an America that operated that way. Well, all of a sudden, this progress that we seemingly had made, in some ways, it seems to be reverting back to the mindset of the ways of yesteryear. It's not segregated, not segregated, but in some ways we've seen this reversal. So it's, I think, very important that you've got a place where you can come and draw strength from what others endured and how they went about invoking change. And that to me is the fundamental foundation of what the Negro League Museum provides. And if you are African American, you see yourself in an entire different light. And if you are other than African American, you now are more in tune to my experience, to my story in this country. And I think that is important across the board. Because again, the more we know about one another, the easier it is for us to get along with one another. And again, what we find is that we have so much more in common than we do differences. But again, this, I hope, teaches you not to be afraid of others' differences. The things that we should be embracing, we have a tendency to run from in our society. We don't want you to run from it. And being different is not necessarily being bad. You know, it's just embracing the things that are unique to each and every one of us. And if nothing else, we hope that it provides a level of tolerance and respect. You may not like me. You may not like me, and that's okay, you know, but there still has to be this fundamental level of respect for other human beings in this society.
Which, as you said so beautifully the other day on our Big Fly Baseball show, that's what this nation was built on. That's what this nation is all about. I will only push back on one thing. I don't know anybody that dislikes you, but if there's somebody out there, that's fine. But your point is 100% taken. I love, and so first off, I don't remember when I scheduled you a few weeks ago to come on. And really, the whole point with this show being more about business, entrepreneurship, leadership, and really kind of seeing how that is going during times that have forced all of us to change. That was really my focus. And I do want to talk a lot about the museum because it's one that, look, you and I have done this so long, I could just put the ball on the tee and just, sit back and say, okay, let's hear this story and this story. And I enjoy that. But, and I do want to work towards that a little bit, but just some of the comments coming in. Zeke Crozier is a former guest on this show. So much strength behind this perspective. Would be honored to meet Mr. Kendrick. Thank you for sharing the story, Joel. To give you Zeke's very quick story, Purple Heart recipient, medically retired from the military, wasn't given a whole lot of chance with some major disabilities, and now he's making an impact in our community with his nonprofit called Handicapping. And so he took he was going through some frustration, and he was banging some bottle caps, and suddenly that turned into this beautiful art that he is doing to raise money for great causes. So it's people like Zeke and heroes like that in our country that will help us get through all times. So I wanted to share that, and I'd love to make that intro. Becky Wilson says, thank you, Bob Kendrick, for keeping the history and spirit of the Negro Leagues alive from Kansas City. I was thinking about you a little bit, Bob, because I believe yesterday, if we don't know the exact date of Satchel Paige's birth, I believe his passing was yesterday, I think. I thought I saw June 8th. I don't know if that's correct or not.
It was in June of 1982.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know if okay if the greatest Nick, we can even debate who had the greatest nickname, but I mean, to me, I think it's a no brainer. Um, am I right on that? Is there a winner for greatest nickname? By the way,
In my mind, Cool Papa is always going to be
that's
the
what I
greatest.
always thought.
Now, there were a bunch of great nicknames in the Negro Leagues. I mean, because again, Joe, when your nickname is so iconic that people think it's your real name,
Right?
Satchel, when I tell people that his name, when I say Leroy Page, and people are like, who? Because they know him as Satchel.
Right.
Or if I say John O'Neill, people are like, who is that?
Right.
That's Buck. So when your nickname becomes so iconic that people think that it's your real name, it's pretty special.
Yeah.
For me, it's Cool Papa. But you had guys like Boo June Wilson. He got his nickname because he hit these line drives off the wall that made the sound Boujum. They would hit the walls up, and so he was Boujum Wilson, or the great Ted Double Duty Radcliffe. Caught the first game of a Satchel Paige shutout, took off the catcher's gear, and threw a shutout in the second game of the doubleheader. Said he was worth the price of 2 admissions. They nicknamed him Double Duty. Or a guy like Nip Winters, so there were a lot of great nicknames in the Negro Leagues, but Cool Papa is my favorite because it captured the persona of James Bell, because Cool was really cool. And of course, he just had this flair and everything about the way he played, the speed, the daringness on the base paths was really special.
What about William? I'm getting off track here. William Julius Johnson, Judy Johnson.
Judy Johnson. Yeah, no, and so the nicknames just go on and on and on and on. Really, if you didn't have a good nickname in the Negro Leagues, you probably weren't any good. Yeah, that was part of it. But you know what, Joe? It matched the style of play, which was, pun intended, colorful. And it was energetic, and it was fast and aggressive and daring. And so you had these characters, some of them larger than life, and so the nicknames, I think, were just a really important part of how they played the game.
I don't think I've ever asked you this question before, but I go off on tangents. How come Josh Gibson didn't? I mean, I know that he was considered the Black Ruth of black baseball, or or Babe Ruth was the Josh Gibson of Major League Baseball. I've heard you tell that many times, but I don't know that I've.
No,
I
Josh didn't have one. I mean,
didn't need one.
Joshua, but yeah, no, Josh didn't have. He was just so good that they just left Josh alone. A guy that's big and strong, they didn't even bother giving him a nickname.
Yeah.
It could have been Paul Bunyan or anybody like that. Because he just carried a big stick, man. He was amazing, and he's one of the few of the greats of the Negro Leagues that really didn't have a legendary nickname to go along with.
Well, in Satchel's case, and I'm looking this up, it says that he passed here in Kansas City June 8th, 1982. So we'll have the 40th anniversary of his passing in a couple of years. So okay, if Cool Papa has the best name, that was my opinion too. What was it, James Thomas Bell? James Thomas Bell, Cool Papa Bell. But, when you walk into the museum and you see all those statues, I mean, to me, the one that stands out front and center, first and foremost, is Satchel Paige. What was it about Satchel beyond the baseball that made him an icon?
Oh, he had, in Hollywood, they call it the it factor. Mm. Yeah, you don't know necessarily what it is, but you know it when you see it. Mm-hmm. And Satchel had the it factor. I tell people now, if he was doing his thing today in this era of social media, he'd be one of the biggest stars on the face of the planet today, just as he was during that era. Joe, the old man would ride into towns and the entire town would shut down to watch him do his thing. His reputation had preceded him. Everybody wanted to see Satchel do his thing. And he just had it. He had the swag, as the kids would say today. He obviously had the great stuff that allowed him to get people out. He always knew how to get people out, and he had the longevity. And so all of it combined, in my estimation, makes Satchel Paige the greatest pitcher this sport has ever seen. Now, there may have been others who were just as good as Satchel. I don't think there was anybody better than Satchel Paige. Not when you combine everything. I mean, massive crowds would come to watch this man do his thing. He was when he got to Cleveland, and whether he was 42 or 52, we don't really know. But let's just, for the sake of this story, say that he was 42 years old, which in our sport, and particularly for a pitcher, is virtually unheard of. Mm-hmm. Well, he comes out of the bullpen for the Indians in 48, his first couple of appearances is out of the bullpen. But when he makes his start, when they finally give him his start, and I remember the story, they're playing in Comiskey Park in Chicago. And the old man is scheduled to pitch this game. Joel, they got 55,000 people in the ballpark. They had to turn away another 12,000 who couldn't get in. They all wanted to see the old man pitch. Well, he shuts out the White Sox 5-0. They go to Cleveland for his next start. And if you remember, Cleveland had old Municipal Stadium, which was massive. I think it held over 90,000 plus people. They got damn near 90,000 in there to watch Satchel again against the White Sox. He shuts out the White Sox again, 1-0. Larry Doby, who would integrate the American League just weeks after Jackie Robinson, drove in the winning run. Now the old man is off and running, because when he gets to the major leagues, on what we believe to be his birthday, July 7th of 1948. And, like I say, he comes out of the bullpen and he couldn't be himself. I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, is that these ball players who were making this transition into the major leagues, they had to some ways temper themselves. And the colorfulness and the character that Satchel was, he couldn't be that in the major leagues. And so it took him a little bit before he got his legs underneath him. But playing in front of big crowds was not new to Satchel. He was accustomed to playing in front of big crowds. And man, the old man was dealing. He goes 6-1 in 1948 with a 2.4 ERA. His rookie season. And at age 42, which again means he could have been 52 years old at the time, man.
No one knows. If you don't know, we don't know. What was Buck's take on that, by the way? Did he have an idea?
Well, Buck always said he knew, but he wasn't going to tell. To me, it is highly coincidental that Satchel shares the same birthday as his good friend Ted Double Duty Radcliffe. Yeah, they're both born on July 7th and both from Mobile, Alabama. That is highly coincidental.
and maybe no surprise that Buck was going to be the ultimate teammate there, and he's not sharing that secret. I'm sure he did know. I'm sure there was a conversation that was had at some point. I want to get back to and this is so beautifully depicted in the museum, where there's not an inch of the museum that hasn't been very well thought out, and that reminded me too of when we were down in Atlanta a few months ago, and each room or each area that you walk into just invokes a different type of emotion. I know that's by design. Yeah. And so, whenever I'm over at the museum on 18th and Vine, even stories, maybe it's still this way for you too, but even stories that I've heard many times, it still gives me that emotion, which is great. We hear so much in and out of the museum about Jackie Robinson, rightfully so, and I hope we'll continue to do so. But I know he wasn't the only one in terms of activists. He was the first one to make that jump. It could have been someone else. Maybe he was the exact right person to be able to handle it and all of that. But I know there's so many others too. Who, just in your research and your history, in all of your studying of this, who would have been some of those guys back then? Maybe it was most of them that would rise up today and be leading the way. I've been really impressed with some of the African American baseball players that are finding a voice right now.
Yeah.
And maybe they had that voice before, but I think so often about, boy, that they are in the greatest of minorities right now in the sport,
Absolutely.
which is a whole separate issue
Absolutely.
that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing some of these guys out on the streets right now protesting, and it really, to me, it warms the heart. It does lead to hope, because maybe they could be influences on their teammates. And if they can be influences on their teammates, these are perhaps white superstars that have the voice of the whole country because they have such massive fan bases. And we spread and we spread. Who would have been some of those guys from that generation that will be leading the way right now?
Well, yeah, I think there would have been any number of guys. You know, as I've always said with you, the first guy who was chosen to break the color barrier cannot fail. Because if the first guy fails, there is no second guy. You know, that's the pressure that first guy had on him. And that's why it made Jackie the right choice. Were there better baseball players in the Negro Leagues? Absolutely. And were there other guys who could have done what Jackie did? I think there were. And the first name that comes to my mind, Joel, is the great Monty Irvin. And Monty Irvin had been the owner's choice for, if someone was going to break the color barrier, they believed that it would be Monty Irvin. Monty Irvin was a superstar player in the Negro Leagues. Much better baseball player than Jackie Robinson was. And Monty Irvin had a similar pedigree to Jackie. Monty had served in the military. Monty was college educated. And so he had that same pedigree that I think prepared Jackie for great success. But Monty, unfortunately, had just gotten back from World War II. And Monty, Joel, was suffering from what they then called shell shock. Today, we would call it post-traumatic syndrome. And Monty was also having contract squabbles with Effa Manley, who owned the Newark Eagles. And Manley was not a fan of Branch Rickey at all. As a matter of fact, she couldn't stand Branch Rickey because she felt like Rickey was maneuvering to take players from the Negro Leagues without compensation. And quite frankly, she was right, because J.L. Wilkinson, who owned the Kansas City Monarchs, never got a dime for Jackie Robinson. He literally took Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. But J.L. Wilkinson was in an interesting juxtaposition because Wilkinson couldn't fight back publicly. You know why? Because J.L. Wilkinson was white. And so there is no way that this white man who had made his entire living in black baseball, there's no way he can stand up and protest what essentially every black person in this country had been waiting on, to see a black man play in the major leagues. Because if he did, it was damned if he did, but honestly, it was damned if he didn't. And so publicly, Wilkie said all the right things as he relinquished and let Rickey take Robinson into the Dodgers organization without a fight. Privately, I believe he was seething. And he wasn't necessarily seething because a black man was going to play in the major leagues. He was seething that this player that you about to take away from me, you gonna put me out of business. And man, he was absolutely right. Yeah, by the 48 season, Wilkinson had sold his business interest to his partner, T.Y. Barrett. He got out of the business of black baseball because I think he understood that when this watershed moment occurred, it wasn't a matter of if, it was simply a matter of when the Negro Leagues were going to die. And so he got out before this would occur. But Effa Manley was prepared to fight Rickey. And so when Bill Veeck comes to get Larry Doby, and you have to remember that Larry Doby goes over just a few weeks after Jackie. Mm-hmm. So yes, he had that same pedigree as well. Doby was a little bit more quiet than Robinson was. People forget that Robinson was very fiery and feisty. As Buck O'Neil would say, Jackie could do and would do. He'd knock you on your rump. But he humbled himself for the greater good. This was completely out of character for Jackie to take the abuse that he took. Uh-huh. And Dobie was a little bit more soft-spoken, very quiet, but also had the same demeanor, had served in the military, was college educated. And he was 23 years old when he joined the Cleveland Indians in 1947. So, yeah, there were other guys that could have done it, but Jackie absolutely was the right man to be the first.
I like doing this sometimes in case people aren't looking stats up. Baseball's so stat oriented, and the shame when you look up the stats of players like Monty Irvin and you see 1949 to 1956 doesn't tell the whole story, because
No.
really you have to look at what they did in the Negro Leagues. However, I bring this up because you wonder about perhaps how one of those guys would do in the big leagues when given the opportunity. In 1951, at the age of 32, Monty Irvin, who would be a future Major League Baseball Hall of Famer, had 121 RBI. He hit 312. He had an OPS of 929. He finished third in the MVP voting in his third season behind Roy Campanella and Stan Musial. So, by the way, Jackie Robinson that year finished sixth. So you talk about that still being early on, and you do imagine, boy, what would it have been like if those men had been given the opportunity that they certainly deserved and that this country wasn't giving others, not just in baseball, but in terms of jobs and what they were doing. I know that you talk about this a lot. Joe Posnanski really captures it beautifully in the book Soul of Baseball. There are many others too. But what were times like back then in the heyday for the Buck O'Neills and the Satchel Pages of the world? Really two-part question. One, what was it like in that spot where you're sitting right now, 18th and Vine? Because I'd like to go back to that. And two, I mean, I would just like to feel that energy of what it must have been like down there. What was life like around there? And then what was life like on the road?
Their challenges really, Joe, came traveling from point A to point B, the highways and byways of our country. But as they got to those areas like 18th and Vine, or South Side of Chicago, or Harlem in New York, well, they were stars. They were some of the biggest stars in Black culture, in Black life. And so, as Buck would say, everywhere they went to the restaurant, it was Black owned, but they were going to get the finest service. The waitress going to give them the best table. That's the way life was. And athletes and entertainers have always made more money than us poor working class folks. Always have and always will. And so for those who played in the Negro Leagues, baseball was indeed their sanctuary. But because of segregation, you had these close-knit and confined cultures, but everything you needed was within that confinement. So here in Kansas City, African Americans could only move within a 13-block radius. But man, you had everything. So 18th and Vine was jumping. It was the place to be. As Buck would say, you might have a relative here in Kansas City that you ain't seen in a little while. Said, just come to 18th and Vine on a Saturday night and stand on the corner. They got to walk by there. And it was so much star power that was a part of this. One of my favorite Buck O'Neil stories, the Monarchs had played a game here on a Saturday night, Joel, and Buck said, everybody said, we're going to go back to the house, we're going to clean up, and then we're going to come and meet at a nightclub called the Subway. Well, the club was called the Subway because it was literally below street level. And so Buck says they're all in the nightclub sipping on a little tea when in walks a kid, got a horn over his shoulder, he wants to blow. Well, everybody said, let him blow. Well, Buck said his kid gets up on the stage and he starts making some noises out of his horn that they had never heard before, but you had to pay attention. That kid was 17-year-old Charlie Yardbird Parker. So that's the kind of star power that was a part of Black baseball. And so it was not out of ordinary to go to a Negro Leagues game and there was Lena Horne or Lionel Hampton, Duke Ellington. They're all there. And then after the games, they're going to watch them do their thing in the various nightclubs. And of course, as you well know, we have images in the museum of Lionel Hampton surrounded by members of the Kansas City Monarchs. He loved the Kansas City Monarchs. Old Buck would put him in a Monarch uniform, and Hampton would sit on the bench and serve as an honorary coach. Or there's the great Louis Armstrong, who had his own semi-pro team called the Armstrong Secret Nine. And as I tell people all the time, all the jazz musicians wanted to be baseball players. Mm-hmm. All the baseball players wanted to be jazz musicians. And so there was this mutual admiration for what the others did. And so they became a very close-knit group. And so what segregation did was it forced ownership. And so the Negro Leagues played a very prevalent role in the rise of so many of these Black-owned businesses that essentially emerged to meet the need that was being generated by Negro Leagues baseball. And so as a result, these confined areas were thriving.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know that I could ask you to tell these stories all day, but I'll wind it down here with just a couple of thoughts. And again, I'll repeat to everybody, if you've never been to the museum, you've got to go. What is, and the original point of this was to talk about the challenging times of the pandemic and what it's done for businesses. And look, I've said this over and over again, we've all been affected by it. I don't care who you are or what you do or where you live. It affects people in different ways, affects companies in different ways. But and that's true for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which I truly believe will be. You guys have dealt with so much, and every time it feels like something gets thrown your direction to deter you, you rise above it. And I have in all my heart believe that'll continue to happen. But like so many others, this has taken people away or kept people away from the museum. So what's going on right now, and what are the plans going forward?
Well, we're looking at our phased-in reopening. We're planning to reopen the museum on June 16th. And so we're excited about that. We've been working diligently, over these last several weeks, trying to put the plans in place for this phased-in reopening, making sure we've got the benchmarks and protocols in place. Number one, to keep our team safe and keep our patrons safe, but to open this museum back up where people can enjoy what we have to offer, including the exhibit that we had just opened in February called Black Baseball in Living Color, the art of Greg Kreindler, a new barrier breaker exhibit that is being installed right now that will chronicle all of the players who broke their respective major league teams' color barriers, from Jackie Robinson in 1947 through Elijah Pumpsie Green being the last to break the color barrier with the Boston Red Sox in 1959. This thing played out over a time span of 12 years. And so we felt compelled that we needed to tell that story because, as you alluded to earlier, we know Jackie's story. And a handful of folks know Larry Doby's story. But the other guys are basically a footnote in baseball and American history. And they shouldn't be, because they all endured a similar plight as they were trying to fulfill their dream of playing in the major leagues. The moral majority of these players over that 12-year time span, Joel, were former Negro League stars. Not all of them, but the moral majority of them were. And so we wanted to tell that story. And as you well know, this was such an important year for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. It's the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Negro Leagues. And we had put together what we thought was an incredible plan. And we're excited about trying to execute that plan. It was going to create perhaps the greatest platform in this organization's history, a national, international platform. And we get off to a flying start. We commemorate the anniversary on February 13th with the Commissioner of Major League Baseball, Rob Manfred, and the Players Association is represented, and a host of other dignitaries, including our great new owner, John Sherman, all there for us as we go back into the Paseo YMCA 100 years from the day that the Negro Leagues had been signed into existence. Major League Baseball and the Players Association announced a joint $1 million contribution to the museum. We announced all of our plans for the season. including a National Day of Recognition for the Negro Leagues, Major League Baseball wide. So, man, we're off and running. And I've been doggone 13 months. I mean, it wasn't a month later, everything comes to a screeching halt. And so, yeah, that knocks a little wind out of your sail. It hurt because you wanted to see what this was going to do. And it was setting the stage to propel the museum into perpetuity. And we wanted that. That's what we want ultimately. When I walk away from this place, I want to make sure that the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is in a financial position that it will be able to operate into perpetuity. And this was going to be that stage, that platform that was going to allow that. And so, yeah, it hurts to not be able to do the things that we had hoped to do this year. But again, as I've so oftentimes shared, and I believe this wholeheartedly, you cannot be a steward of this story and wallow in self-pity. You just can't do it. The players of the Negro Leagues never cried about the social injustice. They went out and did something about it. So it's incumbent that we embrace that spirit. And I think my team here at the museum have done just that. You know, we know, to use a bad baseball analogy, we got to get right back there in the batter's box. You know, that big pitcher, that big right hander to knock you down, you know, threw one up there at your head and knock you down. Now you got to get back in the batter's box, dust yourself off, and try to figure out how you're going to hit it. And I think collectively, that's our mindset. And so, yeah, there's great disappointment in the fact that this COVID-19 pandemic has taken away many of the things that we had hoped to do over the course of this year. But we're already into Plan B, what I call Negro Leagues 101. And, you know, we'll find a reason and a way to celebrate and create the anniversary and keep this thing going. And we'll roll most of the key events over into 2021, and because it won't lessen the magnitude of this celebration.
If people want more information, they can find it at nlbm.com. You'll get all the updates on when the museum is opening, but also ways to be involved and ways to donate. There's so many different avenues to contribute, and I tell people it's not a museum about baseball, which would be great too, and there's plenty of baseball. It's a museum about U.S. history, and certainly very relevant to our times right now, but relevant really to any day, so I can't recommend that enough. I still have places I want to go here with this interview. Jennifer Dehan just said, I love the museum. What is your absolute favorite or most impactful artifact in the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum? I don't know if that is like saying, hey, who's your favorite child? But you got a favorite piece?
For me, it's a nondescript photograph, actually. And this goes back to my childhood and my bias because I'm a huge Henry Aaron fan. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Henry Aaron is my childhood idol. You know, as I told you and Dave, when I was playing Sandlot, everybody already knew that when we played, I'm Henry Aaron. Nobody else can be Henry Aaron but me. And so there's a photograph of Henry Aaron in the museum, and he's standing at the train station in Mobile, Alabama. He's 18 years old. He may have weighed 150 pounds. And for those who know the story of Henry Aaron, he comes into the Negro Leagues. He's on his way to go join the Indianapolis Clowns. At that time, he's a skinny, cross-handed hitting infielder. So he is a right-hand hitter who is hitting with his left hand on top. As you well know, that's unorthodox. The fear is that you would break your wrist hitting in that manner. Well, Henry Aaron, y'all, is knocking the cover off the baseball in a highly unorthodox fashion. Well, when he gets to the Clowns, they put the right hand on top, and of course, the rest is history. Well, I think it's that photograph where people who may have been a little skeptical, you know, I've been telling them all these stories about Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell and Boo June Wilson and Martin DeHigo, and they're all very respectful, you know, like, well, you know, they were probably good, but I don't know if they were as good as old Bob is saying they are. And then you get to this picture of a young Henry Aaron, and you know what he accomplished at the major league level. But very few knew that his career had begun in the Negro Leagues. And it's kind of that aha moment for a lot of our visitors. And in many ways, Joel, I think he validates the other guys. So as our guests start to learn that legends such as Henry Aaron and Willie Mays and Ernie Banks and Roy Campanella all come out of this league known as the Negro Leagues. And they were good young players who became great stars at the major leagues. Then I think it's reasonable to believe that there were guys who may have been just as good or better than them that didn't get that opportunity. So now Gibson and Bell, and even though Satchel gets to the major leagues, I honestly believe that had he gotten that in his prime, the Cy Young Award could have very easily been the Satchel Paige Award. Yeah. And so mainstream America missed some of the greatest baseball players to ever play this game. And for me, that little picture brings that into the fold and into the forefront for people to at least imagine what if the doors had opened a little sooner. Yeah, that's
There,
Henry.
you got that?
That's Henry.
I just found
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Look at
absolutely.
that. Look at that
Yeah,
youngster
man,
right
that's
there.
my guy. And I tell people he's my all-time favorite tour. And we've had some amazing
I know
people
you have.
that I've had an opportunity to walk through this museum, and others who have been here, including two American presidents, and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, former Vice President Al Gore, General Colin Powell, former First Lady Michelle Obama, and a host and plethora of great athletes. And with no disrespect to any of them, they're not Henry Aaron in this kid from Georgia's mind. And so it is still my favorite tour. It's the only time I've ever been starstruck. And he's still the only person I'm ever starstruck around. Whenever I'm around Henry Aaron, I'm this 12-year-old kid again who circled the bases in his mother's living room when Henry Aaron broke Ruth's record in 1974. And I'm that kid every time I'm around him. And so he holds a special place in my heart. And certainly he is one of those greats of this game. He's in everybody's top 5 all-time greatest players. But again, a lot of people did not know that he came out of the Negro Leagues.
Yeah. We so often are surprised. I'm not anymore because the amount of time that I've spent around you. Oh wow, I didn't know that, and so that's part of the education too of reminding people that some of the great stars that you watched or heard about went through these times, weren't given that opportunity, went and found their own opportunity. Final thing, Bob, and we'll wrap it up, and I'll try to tie every bit of this together. We didn't get to the need to grow the game with minorities, but if people want to go to just go to YouTube and look up Big Fly Baseball Show. And I would encourage everybody, if you want more of this, just to watch the hour that Victor Rojas and Dave Sims and Bob Kendrick and I did last Friday. I put out on some of my social a 12-minute recap. If you're short on time, at least watch that to hear some of those perspectives, because I think it's extremely important, and it was a conversation that I really enjoyed and want to continue to have. But over the weekend, since you and I last talked on Friday, violence right there in 18th and Vine. We have issues not just here in the city but around the country of violent deaths, unnecessary. We saw that in the neighborhood. I know how resilient 18th and Vine is. You guys are going to make it through this. I feel like the neighborhood is coming back. I continue to see growth. Just overall, some final thoughts here in terms of where we're at as a country, where we're at as a community, and where you see this going. Because as you said, you are an optimist.
No, I am. I am the eternal optimist, and maybe that's some of Buck O'Neill spilling over on me. I do think, though, that was part of my makeup and being as a kid growing up. And again, I believe in humanity as well. And while we've seen these social ills continue to transpire in our society, I refuse to give up on people. And the fact that so many, and as you touched on it, not just here in the US, but around the globe, have come to this call and are rallying around this particular issue. It gives me great hope that yes, there will be a strategic and systematic solution to some of these issues that continue to plague us as a certain cross section of our population have been targeted and looked at differently than others in our society. And it was somewhat of an awakening for a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
because I think people, when it doesn't necessarily always impact you directly, you don't necessarily take these things in great heed the way that we should. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we sometimes we have a feeling of being immune because it doesn't impact my neighborhood, doesn't impact my community, then it may not necessarily be happening to the level in which the others are saying it's happening. Well, we got an opportunity to see that. And it was disheartening to think that anyone could treat another human being the way that that individual was treated. And through his death, I do think it has created an awakening that was long needed. And I think a sustained effort is going to transpire. I was so enlightened, and I don't know if you had a chance to see this, but Joey Votto, who is
Oh,
Canadian, wrote an amazing op ed piece for the Cincinnati Enquirer yesterday.
yep.
And if you haven't seen it, I would encourage everybody to go Google this op-ed piece that Joey Votto, who is a Canadian, who I think also fell into that he had African American friends, people who he called dear friends, but I don't think he understood in its entirety the things that they sometimes brought to the forefront until now. And he talks about forever being a part of this movement to create change. And I think we're seeing that around the country and around the globe. And that's what gives me the hope that a positive outcome will come from the pain and the anger that we're all feeling right now. It just needs to be channeled. And I think it will be. It'll be channeled in a direction that will create the change that we all want to see.
If anyone just wants to go out there and Google, I think it was My Awakening,
Yes.
Joey Votto, or if you just Google Joey Votto at this point, it'll be out there. Or go to my social media feed. I tweeted about it yesterday. It was one of the most moving pieces because he essentially said, I was being told this was happening up until even being sent the video of George Floyd's death. Oh, don't. And then he saw it. And I think what happened to him was what happened to so many of us
Yep.
because we this wasn't like watching some killing in Hollywood or on a TV show. This wasn't hearing about something where you get some of the video and you don't see all of it. And well, what was the other side, or what people want to see things the way they see them or through their own lens. No, we witnessed a murder take place over 8.5 minutes.
Yeah.
We watched it. There's no watching that in any other way. Nothing else matters. We watched a murder happen, and as I said to you last week, unless we're totally naive, and I'm talking about white people here, if you're naive enough to think that's the only one, and as you and I also said the other day, we both have a lot of cop friends. This isn't a all cop.
No, no,
This
it's
is there is a problem, and not just with police either. In terms of society, systemic racism that is out there that people aren't aware of, and hopefully we are all awake now to see that. So we'll end it there, and I'll just encourage everybody to support the museum. Certainly, if you're here, it's in our community, and if you're outside of our community, it trust me, it's worth your while. I can't wait till you guys are back up and running. That, like baseball to me, will be a sign that we're getting back to where we're supposed to be. So, Bob, I had no intention of going under an hour. I just didn't realize we were over an hour. I thought we'd be going about 20 minutes, but this is the way it goes sometimes. It's good. It's really good. I hope that you have a chance to work on that golf game a little bit. I know that's important. All right, I know that's important. And just keep letting us know what's going on with the museum. Keep letting us know what we can do. My final take is that when you look in the museum, you see the baseball section all donated by another white Canadian who certainly has a love, I think, for the African American community in baseball. Geddy Lee from Rush. You take a look at all of the young white kids. I'll call them kids at that point that helped organize Dress to the Nines. That has
Oh,
brought people together.
yeah.
It's there. We can
No,
get people together here. You know.
no, it is absolutely there. And it goes back to, again, something that my dear friend Buck O'Neill would oftentimes remind all of us. Man, there's always been more good people than bad people. Always have, always will. And he always believed that. And I believe it as well. Sometimes the good people sit silently and watch the bad people do things. But this time, the good people are not sitting silent. Yeah, they have been called to action. And that's why it gives me great hope that things will change, and they will change in a direction that we all want to see. Because ultimately, we just all want to be tolerant of people who are not like us, who don't look like us.
Well said. We'll leave it there. Bob, thanks once again for everything that you do for our community, the world of baseball. And great to hear the stories, as always. They never get old.
Hey, Joel, thank you, man. Thank you for being this great voice to advocate for this wonderful museum. And we're looking forward to opening up June 16th. We hope to see you guys making your way down here when we do open back up.
June 16th. That is next week. So let's
Next,
get that on the
next
calendar.
week. That's
Let's
my
get out there.
That's my birthday gift. My birthday is June 15th, and opening up on June 16th will be kind of my birthday gift.
Well, I'm glad to see that you will be working hard on your birthday, but that's a good thing for sure. All right, Bob, thanks so much. Appreciate it, and
So good to see
good
you.
luck with the reopening.
Thank you, man.
My good friend Bob Kendrick of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is absolutely a treasure. Everything that's going on there is just truly amazing. I'm proud to be a friend of Bob's and the museum, and will continue to support it in any way. Hope you'll support my friends over at JJ's Wine and Spirit, southwest corner of College and Antioch, Wine Wednesday, and KC Cattle Company, Wagyu beef up in Weston, Missouri. Check them out. They deliver to all 50 states. It is truly amazing. And to my friends at Enterprise Bank and Trust, hashtag no stopping you. Back tomorrow with a good medical discussion on the pandemic, a continuation of a past discussion. Thanks again to Bob Kendrick. I'm Joel Goldberg. Thanks for watching Rounding the Bases Live, presented by Enterprise Bank and Trust.